Hello world and Happy New Year to all. I'm John Bruni and you're listening to Strategikon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. Well, 2021 certainly started off with a bang. Brexit, the topic for today's show, is now a reality, while on the other side of the Atlantic, a Trump-inspired armed insurrection in the US, which we'll cover in full after the Biden inauguration, are leading this year's lunacy listings so far, and the year hasn't even gotten off the ground yet. Mind you, while Brexit can be sort of rationalised from a realpolitik perspective, little can rationalise what happened in Washington, D.C. on January the 6th. We can only hope the incoming Biden administration is far stronger and more competent than anticipated, and that it can reunify the American people. Otherwise, the US will be in for another chaos-ridden period domestically, while the US Global Alliance Network struggles to work out what to do next. So today, we'll be talking to you about Brexit. And who better to talk about this topic than our very own Brit, Sage International's Pat Tyrrell. But before we begin, apologies from our erstwhile producer, Tim Whiffen. He's had to take a leave of absence due to work, but never fear, Tim is here with us in spirit. And to prove this paranormal event, I will be asking a couple of questions from Tim to Pat as our discussion unfolds. Hold on to your hats, folks. This could be a very spooky experience. Okay. Today, we are Zooming it because we have an entire video file of this podcast. We will be posting it onto the Strategikon Raw YouTube channel, so have a look at that if you can. Joining me in virtual space from another part of Adelaide is co-host David Olney. Hello, David.
Hello, John. Hello, listeners. I'm coming from the Pangolins' Revenge, which listeners will understand the gag.
And hearty welcome back to our guest, Pat Tyrrell, who's safely ensconced in the lovely Cornish countryside. Welcome back to Strategikon, Pat.
Good afternoon to you, John. Good morning to me. Good afternoon, David. Your introduction does remind me of an probably apocryphal story of Samuel Pepys, who in December 1665 wrote in his diary that 1665 had been a quite awful year, and people were pleased to see the back of it. Historians will note it was the year of the Great Plague in London, in which over 25% of the population of London were killed. He said, "I am looking forward to 1666 as a bright, shining light." How right he was, because later on in that year, of course, the Great Fire of London destroyed what the Great Plague had not been able to destroy, and removed the whole of medieval London. So let's hope that the differences between 2020 and 2021 don't mirror that sort of image.
Yes, fingers crossed for that one. Gee whiz.
Yeah, but let's do a proportional thing on scale here. If 1665 killed 25% of the population, 2020 killed 80,000 Brits, how much of London would you have to lose to be the equivalent fire?
Well,
this makes up for a terrible calculation that strangely my brain finds very entertaining to try and calculate.
We don't want to get too much hate mail, David.
That's not hate mail. It's like, okay, well, what would that mean proportionally?
I know. All right, back on to business, guys. So, Pat, now we're into the whole Brexit thing. What's there to make of it in these early days?
Well, to be pedantic, of course, Brexit occurred a year ago, which is
it's the reality of it now. Yeah,
Britain from the EU. We had a year's transition, and this was so that we could get an orderly agreement for how things were going to be in the post-Brexit age. That orderly agreement was so orderly, it was finally signed on Christmas Eve, and indeed there was no time for individual European nations to ratify it. So they're having to ratify it retrospectively. I think the most important issue as far as the British are concerned is that Brexit is now done. There are a large number of people who were against Brexit, felt that Brexit was not actually in the best interests of the UK, but it's now happened. There's no question about Britain applying to come back into the EU. The amount of sovereignty that we can come back to that term later, the amount of sovereignty we'd have to give up would include joining the euro. We would have lost the famous rebate that Margaret Thatcher negotiated in the 1980s. And generally speaking, it would be something that no British government would consider. So we're out. Things are anew. What are we left with? Well, despite the much vaunted sovereignty, we have an agreement that puts an international border right through the centre of the United Kingdom, down the Northern Irish Sea, between Britain, England and Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And this is being seen, there are teething problems at the moment. The important thing was to leave the border open between the EU in the guise of the Irish Republic and Northern Ireland. This was all part of the Good Friday Agreement, which really brought an end to the internecine warfare of the 1970s to the 1990s. To do that meant that the EU had to check goods going in and out of Northern Ireland. That has actually led to supermarket shelves not being properly stocked in Northern Ireland over these first 2 weeks of 2021. That in itself is not too bad, and people are trying to work out how to make it work. But what it does do is it puts a fissure between England, Scotland, and Wales on one side and Northern Ireland on the other. And one of the successes of the Good Friday Agreement has been that the degree of sectarianism in Northern Ireland has reduced really markedly. And it is not beyond the wildest dreams to think that in 10 years' time, the Northern Irish might say, do you know, it's actually easier if we're part of the Republic of Ireland rather than part of the United Kingdom. We have nothing but angst going to and from the rest of what's supposed to be our country. We might just as well become allied to the Republic of Ireland, and that there could easily be a referendum, say in 10 years' time, and that would lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom.
David,
then come
sorry,
Scotland, but I'll let you interject there, John.
David.
Yeah, that's something that I've sort of thought about too. A lot of people have said that demographically by the 2030s, Northern Ireland is such a different place. By that point, the mix of the population has changed to the point where, the Catholic proportion of the population is much bigger. It's also the fact that with those potential clear links to Ireland that make life easy, again, it could not even be a decision so much about nationalism, but just what makes life easier then fits in well with long-term national sentiment. And it's kind of devolution almost by landslide rather than by deliberate choice. And you'd figure that under those kind of circumstances, Scotland maybe finally gets the courage to do the difficult thing of trying to be autonomous, which it claims to want, but when given the opportunity, didn't choose. And goes, life is so much easier inside Europe. And part of the reason I wonder, like you, Pat, if this could happen, is if you look at the whole question of stocking shelves, it's interesting. So many European companies, where I've read little bits in the European media, are making the point now that it's so much more effort to get stock into the UK. Is it worth the extra money to do it? And will the UK be willing to pay for all the extra time and effort to get European goods in? So suddenly it may not be how much sovereignty, economic sovereignty, does the UK want or have, but a question of, does a mid-sized European company think it's economically worthwhile to even do the paperwork to get their products on the truck or ferry to the UK?
Yeah, and I think the important thing is this, it's not high politics. It comes down to what the man and woman in the street thinks. What are the difficulties of going shopping to the supermarket, or what indeed are the difficulties of logging online and doing what I've done for years, which is click on this and click on that, and it gets delivered the next day or the day after, and that's not going to happen. I think there's a slight difference, or a big difference, between Northern Ireland and Scotland.
Yeah.
Because Northern Ireland, I suspect, will be quite happy to be assimilated into the Republic of Ireland. Now, the Republic of Ireland might not want to take on all the problems of Northern Ireland, and there will be some in Northern Ireland who just say, no, I don't want to be ruled from Dublin. But there is an interaction between them. And there is that, as I say, that international border down the Irish Sea. In Scotland, if the Scots go for independence, and as David says, there is an increasing sort of majority in the polls suggesting they will go for independence, and they keep talking about the European Union, but as the European Union has said, they'll have to apply to become part of the European Union. I mean, Spain, for example, does not want to make this easy, because if it makes it easy for Scotland, then why can't Catalonia say, well, we could be independent, we can be an independent nation and a member of the European Union? And that doesn't fit in well with the federalist Spanish views. So if Scotland decides to become independent and there is a referendum, and let's say it's won by a 55-45 majority, Scotland then has to work out what its financial systems are going to be, how is it going to meet all the criteria for European membership, and then it's going to have to join the queue. Now, the European Commission may well say, well, let's give it a fast track because of past history, because we want to. But even so, that's going to take time. Now, Scotland is not independently wealthy. The days of large deposits of oil in the North Sea have long gone. And of course, oil is hopefully becoming less of a driver than it has been in the last 50 years. So Scotland would have all sorts of problems. But I think it's still, as a direct result of Brexit, we will almost certainly see the dissolution of the United Kingdom, and we'll be left with a rump of England and Wales, which of course amounts to about 49 million out of 60 million. So it's quite a large majority.
I'm just wondering if we can go back a step and we talk about the whole Irish thing. You know, the whole Catholic Protestant issue has not necessarily been completely resolved. I'm wondering just how militant Protestants would be in their resistance of being ruled from Dublin as opposed to London. And would it kick off another time of troubles, but this time with Irish security forces in the crossfire? I mean, it doesn't seem to me that this whole Brexit thing, this whole EU thing is going to necessarily be a wonderful lay down misere for the Irish, that they're all somehow going to walk off into some sort of leprechaun fairyland of federalism. I think that there's still a thing that needs to be solved here before we can even have any confidence that would come to pass, right?
Oh, I think that's entirely right. I mean, I think that the previous generation of Irish Protestant militia, if you like, and the previous generation of IRA combatants have now realized, and the people that supported them have realized, that life actually is better in a peaceful existence. Now, there are still on both sides small numbers of extremists, if you like, who always believe that blowing things up, killing people is actually the best way to solve problems. And you're right. I mean, the history of Catholicism and Protestantism in Ireland is particularly acute. I mean, the Irish government are having a difficult time at the moment with the old Irish convents and the schools that they had for the orphans, where conditions were appalling. And not just, we're not talking about, you know, the archetypal Victorian poorhouse. We're talking things that were happening in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, where children who are still alive today suffered real hardships. Now, but Ireland has changed hugely. Ireland is now a much more secular place than it was 30 or 40 years ago. And it might be that the nature of the new Irish persona is going to be one which the majority of Protestant Northern Irish would actually begin to feel more comfortable with.
Pat, what has the Johnson government done in order to cast a wider international trading net, allowing it to bypass the economic importance of the European Union?
Well, the government are busily trying to get a number of trade agreements, and they've managed with quite a large number of countries. They're also aiming to become a member of the Pacific trade agreements, which may sound odd for a country that actually is a relatively small island sitting off the northwestern corner of Europe, but reflects, I think, the global nature of the United Kingdom heretofore, and that it has still a number of territories, dependent territories within the Pacific region. And we have lots of countries that we consider to be great friends in the Pacific. Now, whether these trade deals are going to make up entirely for trade that we might have lost in Europe remains to be seen. Europe always was our major partner. I think that it's going to take time for those trading links to be replaced. I speak as someone who was definitely wanted to remain in the European Union and felt that the advantages of being in the European Union outweighed the disadvantages, but there were real disadvantages. And one of the disadvantages is from the way that Britain looks at its place in the world. As Professor Lambert discusses, maritime nations and continental nations. Britain is a maritime nation. It bought its wealth by virtue of the Royal Navy and being able to protect those maritime lines of communication. The majority of Europe is a continental nation, and they have a different view of the world. And dare I say it, at the moment, the European Union, and for some time, the European Union has effectively been run along French processes, using the sort of senior French civil servants. We were never great admirers of the European Union structures, so we didn't send our best people to Europe. We kept them, they wanted to build their careers within the UK and within UK directed areas of influence. But the French always sent their best people out to Europe. And if you look at the way that Europe is run, it's run in a decidedly French way, which is a much less individualistic way. It's a sort of, it's based on Napoleon philosophies as to how France should be governed at the beginning of the 19th century. So Europe is becoming, if you like, a political entity. But then, of course, we've seen all the problems we've had with a federalist structure in Washington this week. But all of them speak English. They have a common language and they have a common history. Whereas when we look at Europe, you've got the French, you've got the Germans, you've got the Dutch, you've got the Italians, and they're all different people and have different visions of what they want. And so Europe is not the sort of place I think that Britain would want to go back to. And we want to look outside Europe to other places. We'll get there. It'll take time.
How do you think Britain's relations with China are going to be crafted now Brexit has become a reality? We have a bunch of Hong Kongers who have been flying the Union Jack and thinking about the good old days when they were an appendage of the British Empire. And of course, that's getting up the nose of various senior figures in China. We haven't seen so much of that lately, but I suspect that the sentiment is still there. With a sort of independence from the continent, it's not just an economic independence, it's also a political and a strategic independence. So what will London do with Hong Kong and its relations with China?
Well, I think one should look at it the other way around, because the most important thing is going to be, how are we going to look at our relations with China? Because there is nothing we can do about Hong Kong per se. That can be taken outside our view of what we can do with relations with China. I think that it is quite clear that the Sino-British agreement has been smashed by the Chinese. And the view in London is that, we have got to try to protect the freedoms that Hong Kong enjoyed against China. So we've got to keep protesting, if you look from a diplomatic point of view. You can't ignore China. China is about to become economically the largest nation in the world. But with a group of Western nations, not helped, I have to say, by the scenes that came out of Washington, D.C. the other day, which of course played directly into the Chinese play about, yes, we have protesters and you call them freedom, democracy-seeking protesters, and yet you have protesters and you have to get out your National Guard to seal off the Capitol, and you'll now prosecute them. Deliberately failing to understand or refusing to recognize the significant differences between one and the other. China is going to be a major problem over the next 10 or 20 years. Just in the same way that the Soviet Union was a major problem from 1945 till 1989. China is big enough, it's ugly enough, it's aggressive enough to affect the stability of the rest of the world. And, looking at the Pacific, here we are looking for developing wealth and prosperity, maintaining peace and security. And we've got the Chinese saying, well, hold hard, actually, half of this Pacific really belongs to China, and we have the issue of the Uyghurs. We have the issue of other minorities. And we've got to make sure that we can point out those issues. And when Western companies are told you shouldn't use material that comes from slave factories, we've got to be able to back it up. They've got to be able to get their materials from elsewhere at a reasonable price. But, at the moment, the fox has the run of the hen house. We've given China access to all the Western instruments of democracy. So the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, China knows that we play by the rules. And so they'll go in and help formulate the rules that they like. Now, Britain didn't cover itself in glory by announcing that it was going to break international law when it was negotiating with the European Union over the new agreement. And I regret that deeply, because that means that we are no longer seen as the unequivocal champion of Western values. We clearly have a politician or politicians who will break those if it is in their tactical interest to do so. That's a shame. Likewise, it's a shame that a president of the United States was inciting members of his followers to march on the Capitol. That's a shame. Because if we in the West are to be able to prove ourselves to be worthy of taking the world forward, we've got to be seen to be whiter than white. We've got to chase those human values. And I think Britain will, it's by no means a world superpower. It's not even, some would say it's now possibly no longer a second-rate power and will become a third-rate power. Doesn't matter where we are in the rankings, we've got to identify what are our clear vision of the future and defend those visions against all comers.
Well, it's not all doom and gloom for the Brits, because from how I see it, and I did read a report that supported this, that Britain now has jumped from the number 6 country in the world in terms of gross domestic product to number 5, because India is struggling so badly with COVID, and the Indian economy is, bumping along and not doing particularly well. And it will take them quite some time to recapture 5th spot, if they ever do that. So Britain had an advantage, and really it's now up to them to try to do the best with that advantage as they possibly can. David, you have...
Can I jump in here just quickly, John? Because I was thinking something very similar, that it's very easy to argue the doom and gloom argument. But let's take sort of the other side of this. Okay, the Irish inherit being the English language face for European business, so that people can deal in one language. Number of head offices that have already moved to Dublin is significant. But what the UK seems to have maintained, and there's no sign it's going to change, is it is the centre of murky speculative capital like it has been for 500 years. And historically, the whole idea of being the white knight and representing the best of Western civilization, for a long time, it was a very thin, very fragile mask that became far more cohesive and substantial after World War II and after the end of empire. And in reality, looking from the outside, it seems a lot of people are viewing this opportunity post-Brexit is to jettison stuff that doesn't benefit the UK immediately, and to return to more a what outcome can we get, how fast can we move, how much aggression can we apply. And as long as London remains a centre of capital, I don't think that capital's got much of a conscience. It didn't have much of a conscience historically. And that at the moment, that's fairly appealing to an awful lot of players.
Well, I think that's sort of going back to the old Elizabethan age of, pirate emissaries from Britain going around and ransacking the Spanish treasure ships and singeing the King of Spain's beard. And, there's a lot in that. I mean, there is a lot.
Yeah, but it's the 19th century too. It's high Victorianism. When I can't remember who the famous colonel is within the UK military who creates really the first military intelligence unit. The wonderful book about the unit is called Under Every Leaf. And it pretty much indicates that in the late Victorian period, while the UK was pretending to be quite nice, it was doing dastardly do everywhere and winning everywhere it won. And if we look historically, the difference between 1945 to 1989, watching the decline of the Soviet Union, is the world never did business with the Soviet Union. It contained it. The world chose to do business with China, which means there are going to be different rules for how to compete in a world where we build up the dragon rather than contained it.
I have a lovely cartoon from my time in NATO, and it's figures of different nationality, and it shows a German soldier, and it says, as humorous as a German. And it shows a sort of slightly drunken Dane, and it says, as sober as a Dane. And then there's another one that says something about the French. And then the one by the Brit says, as straightforward as a Brit.
I love
which,
it.
Sums up those sort of national characteristics. And yes, the Brits are, I mean, we are very good at the deception game in terms of military propaganda and whatever, and leading people to believe things when actually it's a sleight of hand and we're doing something else. And, you know, I think that at a tactical level, yes, those skills are still there. Whether they're still as applicable, well, go and ask Donald Trump that. He's been using them for years in terms of social media.
Yeah, but he's also been using them against people who are not part of that world to try and convince them he cares. Really, the question here with the UK is it capable of being lean? Is it capable of being agile? It historically knew how to do both until it became a bloated empire and ran out of steam. But it got to that point by being lean and agile. And the real question no one wants to ask or answer is, in its sort of memory of its past, in its current capability, is there the ability to be lean and agile?
Oh, well, I think that's a very important question to ask. I think that if you look at all empires, you know, one of the things that happens is that they become an empire because they're extremely talented at taking over other people's countries. I mean, look at the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire managed to achieve what it achieved by having really the first world-class military machine that could deploy soldiers anywhere on the continent of Europe and win battles against other people. And then, of course, it becomes, by the end of the Roman Empire, it was unable to be able to counter any of the numerous attacks that there were around the empire.
Yeah, but let's contextualize that. They stopped doing their own security. They didn't secure trade between provinces, and trust was lost and transfer of knowledge was lost. So that can be contextualized as very specific things.
Well, it can do, but also, in fact, the ruling class, which in Caesar's day, if you were a member of a good family, you were required to join the army and learn to serve and fight. By the time the end of the empire came, you know, members of the leading families didn't ever join the military. I mean, they had to pay some fine or whatever for not doing so, but the law was there and observed mostly in its a lack of observance than any strict adherence. And that meant that you no longer had that connection between the tools you used to acquire your empire, which was your military in the Roman Empire case, and the people who were running the empire. There became a disconnect between the people at the top and the people who were acting as the agent or acting as the arm. And the same happened with the British Empire. I mean, it became too big. I mean,
the same is happening with the American Empire. It got too big.
Yeah, the same is happening with the American Empire.
Yeah.
And the same will ultimately happen with the Chinese Empire.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
But in the short term, the question is at the moment, if the best lever at the moment is that ability to accumulate murky money and apply it fast for high return, which is London's greatest asset literally since World War II, has it got the ability to, you know, actuate that under state control for state benefit? Or have you just become a home to billionaires who do as they please and don't pay enough tax?
Well, of course, there is a view that Britain should try and become Singapore, the Singapore of northwestern Europe, by reducing company taxes, by making lighter regulation rather than heavier regulation, and by encouraging, I mean, doing what the Irish did in terms of encouraging large corporates to come and use Britain rather than any other country. I'm not sure we'll go quite down that route, but I think that we will be driven. I mean, I think we're about to enter an era where the economics is going to, I mean, we've just been through a year, it'll be 18 months by the time the economy can start to recover throughout the world. 18 months when the British economy will have fallen faster than at any time in history, because of lockdown. I mean, we're in lockdown at the moment. And so the factories are not working, systems are not working. City of London is still working, but modern technology allows it to work from home.
I want to pick up something that David said. I mean, we talk about, can London do things? Can Britain do things? Which to me supposes that there is a strength of government somewhere. But as we all know, in the West, there is no strength of government. It is all about where the money is. It's all about the oligarchs, the billionaires, but they are not the government and they will not be moved. They are there as self-interested parties to make sure that the shareholders get their returns. They are not going to be bullied by Boris Johnson, or dare I say, Donald Trump when he was president, or Joe Biden for that matter, or Scott Morrison. These guys are the meat puppets of the oligarchs. They're not going to be doing any, they're not going to invest their companies in high strategic gambles, because that's what the traditional role of government is all about. And if you can't convince oligarchs to march down that path, I mean, we're not reinventing the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company. These corporates are a different beast, and they do look after themselves quite well, and they do not kowtow to politics.
No, but do they have a home they're willing to defend? And that becomes a very important question, because if the public service and the military can't be used well, and you don't have an economic tool, you can have as much rhetoric as you like, and that's kind of what we're tinkering around here. The public service is doing a good job of jabbing people for COVID. The NHS is working reasonably well based on its resourcing in a neoliberal world. The British military has shrunk massively.
Yeah.
There's a ton of money in London, but can anyone bring it under useful control?
Yeah, that is.
Or does it just become a cowboy Western town where the oligarchs walk into town, buy what they please, and go back to their ranch?
And the oligarchs have got all the security they can buy. They've got the Wagner Group. They've got all these other private military companies that are now they're just rolling them out wherever they need them.
So really, London becomes a financial city in the middle of a country that can't necessarily access it.
Well, of course, if we go back to economics 1.0, the importance about having money sloshing about is that some of that money will accumulate to the government in terms of taxes, whether it's sales taxes, whether it's income taxes, whether it's inheritance taxes, or whatever it might be, which can allow the government to do certain things. I mean, let's look at big international company that has done extraordinarily well over the last 15 years, 20 years, namely Amazon. There is no doubt that Amazon in many ways is a force for good in the UK, certainly, and I'm speaking just from the UK's point of view. I mean, here we are in lockdown, and yet, whenever my lady wife wants to go and click on the internet, an Amazon man will turn up at the end of the drive and deliver a parcel. And of course, as a result, I mean, Bezos is, I think he's now the second richest man, because he's just been taken over as the richest man. Yeah. But he's the second richest man in the world with his personal wealth is equivalent to many nations' GDP.
Mm.
But it's that, how do you keep the cycle going that generates wealth? Now, we do have a problem in the UK, but I don't think it's only the UK. We have a problem that our wealth generation is concentrated on London and the southeast of the country, which means that getting that wealth to move up to other parts of the UK, particularly those parts that were historically the sites of heavy manufacturing, shipbuilding, steelworking, etc., is very difficult. And it's a problem that political parties have strived with over the last 10 or 15 years. And
or have they avoided it because it was more convenient to buy from overseas? Well, certainly in the Australian case, we just haven't done it.
No, we haven't.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very fair comment. You know, they talk a lot about it, and at election time, they'll go around and say, yes, that we must put more money into this area or that area. And then, of course, when they're in government, you know, funnily enough, it doesn't become a priority. But to be able to satisfactorily, you know, to be able to get wealth into those areas, you need to create a lot more wealth in your wealth generation areas.
There is a problem with all of this. I hate to say it. The success of China is based on the fact that they have got what we lost. In terms of their governance, you know, it's awful, it's totalitarian, but the one thing that they can do now, and they do now, that we lost a couple of generations ago, is that they can marshal their own forces. There is a level of patriotism among their wealthy. So whether or not you happen to be a former soldier in charge of a state-owned enterprise, or whether you happen to be, you know, whatever that rich tech guy who's disappeared, was it Jack Ma?
Yeah, Jack Ma. Yeah, but
it doesn't matter, but there is almost like a fealty that all elements of the economy give, all economic actors give to the power of the state. So if China said...
Well, fealty or fear, it could be either.
If we go to war tomorrow to conquer Taiwan, for instance, just hypothetically speaking, it is a good bet that most of China will be able to ramp up and mobilize as many resources as it possibly can for that aim. However, in the West, what we've tended to do is we've let people and individual wealth grow in these vast pockets. And look, I'm not particularly convinced that tax is a way in which government will be able to reclaim things back, because really the oligarchs have no constraint on their wealth generation. When governments get taxed, they are obliged, well, certainly they try to be obliged, to plumb that back into society in roadworks or other things, but they don't necessarily build wealth. And therefore they can't marshal wealth in a similar capacity as the Chinese do. That's why China uses their economy as a strategic weapon. We cannot, because we can't go to our local oligarchs and say, you know, those Chinese over there that you've been dealing with for the last, 10, 15 years, milking them for everything you've got. I think it's time that you actually pull your factories out and set up shop back into the UK.
Well, what we can see is that Japan is doing that. They're paying their companies to decouple. So you can do a lot with sovereignty if you have the guts. But again, there's no evidence. Well, okay, it looks like the Europeans are beginning to decouple. The Germans are not decoupling as fast as the Japanese, but they're beginning to decouple from China as well.
Yeah, well, that's going to be a long-term process.
But that's the thing, decoupling's too slow. UK needs to do something now.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the thing that, Britain now has to do. I mean, now it's an existential race.
It's now, and that's the problem, and I can see no evidence that anyone understands now.
Yep. Anyway, look, let's get into a couple of other aspects of Brexit, because we don't keep dear Pat waiting for us. All right, now look. Firstly, has Brexit damaged the UK's security standing in NATO?
No, I don't think so. I think that Britain has and NATO has a long experience of Britain being a member nation and being one of its stronger member nations, and indeed of the European nations, despite the fact its military forces are now far less, it is still the leading European military. And indeed, very recently announced by the Prime Minister was the uplift in terms of financial assistance. Of course, the military will look very different from what it looked like 5, 10, 15 years ago, but then the threats that we're facing are very different. I mean, we are in the view of one of our military chiefs, we are in a war situation at the moment in terms of cyber warfare that is going on all the time. When you look at where Russia has been, where China is, where North Korea is, these are all present dangers to the NATO and to the alliance, and Britain is stepping up to the plate, and we've still got quite a long way to go, and we've also got to try to encourage in NATO a understanding of what the threat is, particularly in Germany. Germany is the richest country in Europe, and yet really does not pull its weight in terms of its military capabilities.
It is the weakest link.
It is a very weak link, and we have this discussion about, well, are we looking towards the east or are we looking towards the west? I think that there is no doubt that Britain is seen as being a staunch ally. I think there are still issues to be worked out with how NATO ensures it's got the force structure to be able to counter any incursion that may come from a resurgent Russia, particularly into the Baltics, or indeed wherever it might attack us using cyber warfare.
Pat, I've got a couple of questions from Tim. So this is going to be the spooky part of the podcast because he is here in spirit. Right? Okay, Tim, here we go. Considering that Britain retained its monetary sovereignty, has this made its disentanglement from the European Union easier?
Oh, and undoubtedly. I mean, I think that if we had gone and had adopted the euro at the beginning of the euro experiment, I think that coming out of Europe would have been nigh on impossible. But we were talking about the City of London before. The City of London has remained quite happy working on sterling. It works just as well in dollars and euros and pounds. That would have been very much more difficult.
Second question from Tim. Do you think that Britain is now more neoliberal post-Brexit, pulling away from a continental European bloc that's put more emphasis on social democratic economic models?
I think time will tell on that. I think that, if you'd been looking at a Britain pre-1950, you would have seen a Britain that was much more like America today in terms of, you've got to pull your weight, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. The big thing that changed, of course, for Britain was the initiation of the National Health Service. And the National Health Service, this welfare state that covers people from literally cradle to grave, and certainly the way that the National Health Service has worked over the coronavirus crisis, has proved to, I think, Brits at all levels that, a degree of welfare state, encapsulated in the term public health, is essential for any modern country. And the fact that if somebody gets ill, they are going to be treated, and that treatment will be free at the point of use. Now, of course, the National Health Service costs an awful lot of money, and that comes out of general taxation, and that means in some cases taxation is clearly higher than it would be if you didn't have it. But is the National Health Service perfect? Good God, no. Nowhere near it. But I know if I have an acute problem, somebody will take care of me. And that's a big relief. I don't have to worry about, is my health insurance up to date, or I've moved jobs and I've lost health insurance, and, what am I going to do if. Now, if I have a chronic illness, National Health Service isn't necessarily as good as it might be, but it is there. It does do things. Can it be more efficient? Oh God, yes, easily. There's an awful lot, like a lot of these organizations, there are too many chiefs and not enough Indians. And, we always seem to be manned up, if you like, to face a sort of, problem, a sort of structure that we might have recognized back in Elizabethan times, where you have this very pyramidal structure. We now have technology that allows a lot of different structures, some of which are equally as effective, and many of them are more so. Yeah. So, health service will need to change. In terms of our socio-liberalism, I think that if you look at the two political parties over the last 50 years, they have tended to congregate around what you might loosely call the centre. Now, that centre has probably drifted more to the liberal side than to the neocon side, as it were, but they've been broad agreement. Every so often we'll have the delights of Nigel Farage or Jeremy Corbyn, sort of on the periphery. But I think the Labour Party now seems to be coming back more into a mainstream, and that's good for democracy. Because what democracy requires, and if Mr. Donald J. Trump is listening, this is what democracy requires, is the ability to accept when somebody else wins an election, your opponent wins an election, that they will come in and they will have their policies. Now, if they're sensible, their policies are not a million miles away from the rest of the population's policies, because there's a general societal consensus as to what needs doing. So, and I think that we've probably got that, and hopefully after the problems of Brexit and the highly partisan politics that were coming out, I hope we're going to get back onto that route and retain a social liberal core.
David, final comments or questions for Pat?
Sort of a comment that might grow into a question. It seems that Europe has come up with one form of managerialism that the UK doesn't like. But in reality, the fact that the two parties are once again relatively close means they've agreed on a form of managerialism that Europe probably doesn't really like. The problem is at the moment, the UK doesn't need managerialism. It needs leadership, and it doesn't need to repeat yesterday. It needs to do something new tomorrow. And that the hardest thing to regain in a hurry is leadership.
I would entirely agree that leadership is a key. I don't think we have leadership at the moment. I think that we have had good leaders in the past. Even our leaders are human and have the failings that one would expect of human beings. But we always need good leadership. Yeah. And the Western world needs good leadership. And after 4 years of Donald Trump, let's hope we get that. I'm not over optimistic that it will be great leadership, but at least it will be a leadership by somebody who understands where we ought to be going.
I vote for Arnold Schwarzenegger. I don't know if you guys had seen his little clip where he kind of gave it to Donald Trump quite nicely over the January.
With his Conan the Barbarian sword.
Oh, come on, that's just so Arnie. But it was just a refreshing. I don't know. There is a bit of a gravitas around him. He's obviously with a diverse career that he has had. The guy's got some serious smarts going on there, and I think he really did touch on a few very good points. But anyway, Pat, just one final question from me on this before we wrap up. And considering Tim's questions and all the questions that have been put before you, are we now facing two Western Europes? You've got the UK centered around London, and then you've got Brussels and all the other nation states of the continent. And if we have two Europes, or two Western Europes, what do you think the other Europe, namely Russia, will make of all of this?
Well, I would remind you of the headline in the Times about the April 2022, when there was a very severe fog in the Channel. And it said, fog in Channel, continent isolated. And that says it all as far as the UK is concerned, is that when you are looking over at the English Channel towards Europe, they're over there and miles away. Now, I think that looking at where Russia is, Russia has... Its problem has always been it's never really understood whether it was a European power, a nation power, or it was a power on its own. It was always different. It was more Turkic, if you like, than European. And I think Russia is still confused as to where its role is, having been rolled back from the Middle Europe and the areas of Poland and Hungary that it controlled during the Soviets. I think that there will always be, vive la différence in terms of where the UK is, where France and Germany are, and where Russia is. What we've got to do is to make sure that we don't make the mistakes of previous generations and resort back to war.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, everyone, that's a wrap. Thanks, Pat, David, and Despirito Timo for being on Strategikon. And to our audience, thanks for listening. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to the audio version of Strategikon through the Ozcast network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. And please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. You can also watch our podcasts on video on the Strategikon Raw YouTube channel, easily accessed by clicking on the link provided on our website. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. If you would like to support Strategikon, remember to check out our merch page. I'm wearing a t-shirt right now. It looks great. Buy one. We have a wide variety of items to keep the Strategikon listeners satisfied. Until next time, goodbye.